Hey guys, welcome to the after show of the abortion ethics interview that we did with Dr. Calum Miller. We're going to get right into it and start with the question that we left off at, which was from, let me see if I can pull it up here. It's from 12345 Sushi. He says, how do you respond to the thought experiments that pit the life of the unborn with the life of the mother and extract the logic that unborn babies don't have the same rights? For example, like in a burning building, if there are hundreds of fertilized eggs and there was a mother, and you can either save the 100 eggs or the mother, most people choose the mother.
Yeah, good question. I think it's one actually, if I'm honest, I think a lot of pro-lifers don't give very good responses to this. And I think really the thought experiment has a bit more power than pro-lifers often give it credit for. Now, of course, if you're thinking about actually kind of turning this into a real abortion situation, this is it's extraordinarily rare. So there are 200,000 abortions in the UK each year, at least 200,000, and at most 100 of them are to save the life of the mother. So it's never gone over 100 as far as I can tell from the last few years, because we keep quite good documentation of this. And actually a substantial number of those, I think possibly even as much as a third or a half of those, are for mental health reasons. And it's kind of up for debate to some extent how life-threatening what a condition there actually was. And so it is extraordinarily rare to have a need to have an abortion to save the life of the mother. And that's obviously very important. And of course, it's legal in almost every country, even when abortion is otherwise illegal. So I realize that's not what the thought experiment necessarily gets at, but that's just some helpful framing for those who want to kind of put this into reality for abortions to save someone's life. Um, when we get into the thought experiment, what I think it actually attempts to show is that we don't really intuitively think that kind of an embryo is a human person because we're willing to sacrifice 1,000 or 10,000 of them to save the life of like a child. And if we really consider them as equal persons, then we wouldn't do that. We would save like 10,000 or something. Now, the way I like to think about this is really to kind of use another analogy, which I think highlights the role that kind of social relations play and social kind of value, in a sense, plays in saving lives and in decision making about which lives to save. And so I like to think of an analogy of you're on like a desert island and there's a ship that comes to save people, but actually it can only fit one person on, or maybe it can fit five people on. Now on the desert island, or it can only fit, let's say it can only fit five kind of children on. Because of the kind of mayhem that they cause, and it's just very difficult for the people to look after the children. There are not many children the ship can look after, and so they say you can save five children off this desert island, or the rest of the island is filled with people who are in comas and who don't know anyone else. They have no kind of remaining family. They have no remaining friends. We don't necessarily know if they will come out of the coma. And they have no real kind of social ties to anyone or relational ties to anyone. And they're not currently conscious. But the ship can take a whole load of them because they don't cause much bother. They can just pile them up and put them all on and save maybe 10 or 20, or maybe even more, and save significantly more. Now, there are two ways to respond to this thought experiment. One is to say you should save as many people as you can, and those people in comas who are hermits and who have no friends, no family, no relational ties, who aren't conscious at the moment and might not ever come out of the coma, they're equal human beings, and so they should be saved first. And you should save more of them because you can fit more of them on. Um, what that does, I think, is show that human equality doesn't mean that decision making about which humans to save is always just a matter of numbers. Humans are equal in the sense that they all have a basic level of respect, which means that it is wrong to take their lives. And there's a basic level of seriousness such that taking their life is seriously wrong. But it doesn't mean that that is the only thing we should take into account when deciding who to save. Because there might be things when we take into account who to save, such as whether that person has a cure for cancer, whether that person has remaining family, whether that person kind of is well integrated into a society, whether that person is likely to recover from a coma or is already kind of conscious, and so on. And human equality doesn't mean that those considerations can't come into play. And so, what I think actually the thought experiment shows is either you choose the 10 people because you think that 10 people is more than five and you choose the 10 people in the comas, in which case there really shouldn't be an obstacle to choosing 10 embryos over five children, because the embryos likewise are not conscious. They might never be conscious. They have no social ties. They have no relational ties. But nevertheless, if they just happen to have the same value, we should save them. And so maybe you think that's the case. What most people, I think, would say is that you should save the five children in the desert case and in the burning lab case. And what I think that shows is not that human equality is false, and I don't think it shows that the embryos are not really humans with full moral status, just as it doesn't show that the 10 people in comas are not humans with full moral status. What it shows is that human equality doesn't mean that those other factors can never come into account when deciding who to save. And so, when deciding who to save, you might also factor in things like, does this person have a family, or does this person have dependents who depend on them? Is this person well integrated in society? Is this person likely to recover from their unconscious state, and so on? And if those factors are morally relevant, then you can actually explain why it would be okay to save a child over five embryos, even if they have the same basic value and they are all human beings with kind of equal dignity, and it's wrong to kill all of them. It might nevertheless be the case that you can save one person over five because these other factors come into play, despite their all having a basic equal level of value. So I hope that makes some sense, and that's the way I really like to think about that case.
Yeah, that's interesting to think about it in terms of like saving. I think that's a really interesting way of putting it. So I wanted to say real quick that something happened on YouTube where it like started the stream late, even though it was recording. So basically, I mean, I think everyone that's watching live kind of understood what the objection was and what we were covering. So I think it's okay. But if you guys are watching, comment in the live chat if you'd like me to repeat anything. All I did was basically spell out the objection, and then he started his response, and I think that's where you guys picked up on. I think the whole video will play it regardless because it was recording on YouTube's end. Anyways, it looks like this is a YouTube issue. Well, if you guys have any more questions or objections to anything that Calum said in response to the case, the thought experiment, then leave it in the live chat and I'll be sure to read it out. But in the meantime, I'm going to read the next question, which is from Matthew 1. What does ground human rights or the right to life? What's the grounding of that?
What's the grounding of it? Great question. And again, I think this is something that we probably pro-lifers disagree on, and I'm pretty certain that at least some pro-lifers disagree on it, because if you look at Don Marquise's paper, for example, who we mentioned earlier, that the idea that killing is wrong because it deprives someone of a future like ours or a future life of value, he seems to grant. I don't know if he talks in this term of right to life. I don't think he does from memory, but he says kind of, in effect, he says that the right to life is grounded in someone or an individual kind of being having a future life of value that it would be wrong to deprive them of. I actually don't think that's the case. I think that can't really account for human equality, and it can't account for the kind of basic level of wrongness of killing, even though it is part of the wrongness of killing. I In kind of secular terms, I think you have to say that the right to life is grounded in something like respect for human beings. And I think that is intentionally vague and nebulous because most philosophers actually have no idea what the real grounding is. But a lot of people who talk about human equality and who talk about kind of the wrongness of killing do say that it might be something to do with respect for persons or respect for humans. And it's this idea that as I say, it's difficult to really articulate and difficult to kind of boil down to anything more fundamental than that. But it's the idea that human beings, in virtue of their being a human being, have a kind of basic level of dignity, or which killing violates and therefore is wrong. And so on one level, you can say, from my perspective, what grounds a right to life is being a human being. If you want to go a bit deeper, you can say it in kind of secular terms, it might be being a rational being. And the way I like to kind of explain that is to kind of describe it as a rational being is a being which is for it's a being for whom the norm or the normal kind of flourishing is to be rational and to have kind of substantive and meaningful and advanced relationships with other people. And so one of the ways the nice thing about this is it gets around the kind of accusation of speciesism. It's not just we think a right to life is grounded in being a human because humans are randomly kind of they just randomly as a species have a right to life at the expense of other species. It's because it's normal for a human, and human flourishing involves having kind of rationality and being in kind of substantive, robust and advanced kind of relationships and meaningful relationships. Whereas on the other hand, so for example, if a human being is not capable of that, we consider it unfortunate and we think we should try to help them to be capable of rationality and meaningful relationships. On the other hand, a dog is not able to have those meaningful relationships or to have rationality, but we don't think that's unfortunate at all. We don't think it's abnormal for a dog not to be kind of able to do that. And this kind of, I think, kind of helps justify an intuitive sense that humans and dogs, for example, are different, not just because they happen to differ in their species, but because one of them has a kind of norm that involves relationship and rationality that the other doesn't. And I think that's intuitive to most people. So I think you could say the right to life is kind of grounded in being a rational being, which means it's the norm for that kind of being, or flourishing for that being consists in being rational and having those advanced, meaningful relationships. Now, of course, as a Christian, I think this is inevitably going to be tied up in the kind of identity and the dignity that we get from being created in God's image. And as with most ethics, I think once you actually boil down to the real fundamentals, I think it's very difficult to explain anything in ethics or any moral knowledge without God. And so I think you can explain it to some extent in secular terms, and I think you can defend it in secular terms, and it makes a lot of sense and it has a lot of intuitive appeal. But I think ultimately it will be down to the fact that God created us in his image. And actually, I think it's difficult to account for human value at all. Whatever you think about abortion, it's difficult to account for human equality and human rights or anything without a kind of theistic background to it. And so it's not to say that the pro-life view is essentially religious or it's impossible to defend without being religious. It's only religious people who are pro-life. That's not the case. But it is to say that for any ethical question, I think, and particularly questions of human value, I do think thinking really hard about it, although it can be defensible to a secular mind and with secular intuitions, I think really boiling it down to the fundamentals does reveal something of humans being made in God's image and reflecting his dignity and his value and his love for us.
So we have a couple questions on our Patreon page itself, which they were actually able to post these way before we went live. And because I don't think he's able to watch live with us. His name is Russ Jones. He says, Dr. Calum, Mark Twain quipped that the all too famous claim, there are lies, damn lies, and statistics. In some of your talks, you discuss statistics without, in my humble opinion, providing proper context. For example, you cite that mortality rates for pregnant women are lower than non-pregnant women and those who have had abortions, without explaining the clear selection bias involved. For example, a woman must be to some degree healthy to become pregnant in the first place. Women who are already very ill tend not to try to and become pregnant, and women who seek abortions are more likely to be in poverty, which is associated with a higher mortality rate regardless of whether one is pregnant. When making an argument from a scientific position, do we require a higher degree of disclosure in the statistics we cite?
Yeah, that's a really fair question. And one of the criticisms of this paper, which is the paper it's a series of papers by Mika Gisler, and a few other researchers from Finland, and one of them was published in the American Journal of Obstetrics and Gynecology in 2004. And their paper, it doesn't go into the kind of confounding factors. It doesn't go into the kind of pre-existing mental health. It doesn't go into the other variables at play. And of course, those will be relevant and those will affect mortality outcomes. And so I never intended to claim or imply that abortion necessarily leads to a higher mortality rate or puts you kind of at a higher risk of mortality. I do think you can defend something like that claim, but it requires a significantly more time and more in-depth kind of detail on kind of the causes of maternal mortality, the causes of mortality after abortion, and looking at suicide rates after abortion. So one thing I would say here is that what I usually use that slide to show is that it's not obviously the case that abortion is safer for women, that abortion is kind of something which reduces the mortality rate. I say superficially, without looking at the confounding variables or factors, it seems that abortion is associated with much higher mortality rates. And actually, this fact alone, I think, kind of guards against the view that the reason pregnant women have lower mortality rates is because they're healthier than non-pregnant women. That is partly the case. Pregnant women, you need to be somewhat more healthy to get pregnant than, you need to be somewhat healthy to get pregnant. And so pregnant women are likely to be more healthy from the start. But I think the fact that once someone has got pregnant, whether they get an abortion or whether they continue the pregnancy affects the mortality rate quite significantly, and that those who end the pregnancy shoot their mortality rate way back up higher, kind of guards against the view that this is just explained by kind of pre-existing health. But the main thing I tried to show from that kind of slide alone is just to say that there's no obvious kind of case to be made that abortion reduces your risk of mortality or that pregnancy is like a threat to your life. I think you have to make that case and that you need to show it quite robustly. And I don't think anyone has achieved that. But what I do almost always say in these presentations, I think I always go on to this, is that when you look at the causes of mortality in more detail, which is the important thing here, and when you look at the confounding variables, which that paper doesn't do, but other papers do it, the main difference in this mortality rate is a difference in suicide rate. Now, the suicide rate is much, much higher after abortion than after continuing a pregnancy. Once you control for confounding variables that could also affect that discrepancy, there's not as clear a difference, but there is still clearly a difference. So I talk about a series of papers by David Ferguson in top psychiatry journals. And these are papers which do look at all the confounding variables. And David Ferguson was a pro-choice psychologist. His studies were actually consistently rated as the best studies on the subject, even by kind of pro-choice organizations and pro-choice reviewers. And he was pro-choice himself. And what he showed is that even when you control for those confounding variables like pre-existing health, pre-existing mental health, socioeconomic status, domestic abuse, all of these things which could affect the suicide rate, even once you keep those all constant, the suicide rate is still not drastically higher, but significantly higher, statistically significantly higher after having an abortion than after having a baby. And carrying the baby to term. And so what this does show is that actually when you look at the real causes driving that difference in mortality rates, and you look at the confounding factors behind those, and you look at those in detail, actually looking in detail at the context does seem to vindicate the idea that abortion does put you at a higher mortality risk, at least in the case of suicide, which is one of the main mortality risks for women of childbearing age. It's one of the top couple of things that kill women of childbearing age. And so I think there is actually a strong case to be made, at least on suicide grounds, that abortion is causally associated with a higher risk of mortality. I don't know many studies that look at the physical causes of mortality in women of childbearing age and look at all the confounding factors and look at the association between abortion and pregnancy. But at the very least, the prima facie data, the superficial data, don't seem to suggest that um, pregnancy is very significantly more risky than abortion, and it certainly doesn't seem to outweigh the risk that abortion poses in terms of suicide rate.
All right, so we have another question. This one is from Tom Kendrick, and he's also, I think his real name is Jordan. Uh, his name is, or not his name. His question is: if you are a Bible believing Christian, why do you not think the Old Testament is a good place to find out what God thinks about abortion and the sanctity of life? And if you did, you would be pro-abortion and pro-religious genocide.
Yeah, I guess it's a difficult question to answer in the sense of um, why exactly he thinks the Old Testament kind of endorses abortion. It
Yeah.
might be
So
that he's
so later on, he says, and this is his most recent comment. He says it's impossible to hold the sanctity of human life in value when you literally worship a God who literally murdered an entire planet full of human life for the crime of being evil.
right. So I think there's a kind of a couple of things there. One is potentially a slight tangent, but it often comes up, is people often say that there's a passage in Exodus or Numbers, or maybe both of them, that kind of justify abortion because they seem to say that the unborn child is not as valuable, and that it's okay if you hit a pregnant woman and she has a miscarriage. There's no kind of blood money that has to be paid, or there's no substantive punishment. And so people say this suggests that there is the Bible, the Old Testament seems to see the unborn child as less than human. That actually, I think, is probably a misreading of the text. And I think actually what the Bible does seem to say, and I think this is the more accurate translation, is that if you hit a pregnant woman and she has a miscarriage, there is actually a really substantive punishment. It's that if you hit a pregnant woman and no one is harmed, neither the woman or the baby, then there is very little punishment. And so there's more that can be said about that, but I have a blog on it which people can go to if they're interested. In terms of the more general question about the God of the Old Testament and how kind of genocidal he was, or how kind of anti-sanctity of life he was in that sense. There are a few different things I think I'd say, and this is a little bit of a difficult question to answer because Christians have really varied responses to it. Um, one of the things I think upfront to say is that many Christians, and in fact many Christians from the early church, have said that many of these passages um, were hyperbolic and were kind of to do with spiritual warfare. And that is kind of, I think, a reasonably authentic early church interpretation. It's not necessarily one I'm convinced of myself, but I think it's consistent with how Christians have always interpreted the Bible, to say that these were supposed to be interpreted by Christians as being about spiritual warfare, and that's, I think, an authentic Christian interpretation. And if that's the case, then of course it gets rid of some of the problems quite cleanly and immediately. Now, of course, there are some ways that kind of respond to the problems less cleanly and less immediately, but which I think still have considerable merit. And one of these is to say, I think you have to really distinguish the some kind of cases of killing in the Old Testament from others. I mean, some cases seem like very clear, just instances of capital punishment, which, even if you disagree with, are a very far cry from kind of what seem like very unjust instances of first degree murder. And I think it's important to keep those separate. And in many of the cases where it seems much more unjust for people to be killed, the Bible doesn't necessarily condone it. It often just describes it. Or sometimes it describes the Israelites doing something that God allows even, but that the Bible is clear God doesn't ultimately condone. And so a really good example of this is when Moses allows divorce for certain circumstances. Jesus later says that was not God's plan, and God does not condone divorce in those circumstances. God does not support that, but he allowed it because of the hardness of the Israelites' heart. He allowed it because the Israelites were in a place where they just did it, and he was kind of coming down to their level in a kind of humble way, and allowing some of their practices for a certain time before fully revealing his character. And another example, more on topic would be the example of King David, where God appears at sometimes to command certain wars where David kills people, but then reveals very clearly, even in the Old Testament, he says to David, "You will not be able to build my temple because you have blood on your hands," and it was wrong. And so there are difficulties and nuances with interpreting these passages, but I think what the Old Testament is clear on is that it's not a fully clear picture of what God supports and what God condones. Sometimes it is God coming down to people's level in a world, let's not forget, where war was a part of everyday life. War was kind of the standard in that kind of time. It was a violent culture where the death penalty was rife, war was rife. People were always battling and taking lives, and so there wasn't this kind of sensitivity about sanctity of life that we have in kind of the 21st century West. And so God, in coming down to that kind of culture, I think is within his rights to kind of tolerate for a certain time the very brutal and violent and murderous aspects of that culture, as long as he makes it clear in due time that he does condemn that violence and that killing. And he does that, I think, very clearly in the person of Jesus, who shows that even when he had the power to kill people, when he had the authority to kill people, and even when he had the justice to kill people, even when it was completely just for him to kill people who were trying to kill him, he didn't, and he gave his life for them, and he showed what love and what God's character was really like by laying down his life for them. And so I think that really shows the heart of God and what God thinks about killing. And so that is kind of most of what I would say about kind of killing in the Old Testament, and how it doesn't necessarily reflect God's kind of ideal heart and God's ideal will. The only caveat I would put to that is that, as I say, sometimes killing can be just, and sometimes in the Old Testament there are instances of killing where it's in self-defense or it's in capital punishment where someone deserves it. That's not to say I support our society having capital punishment, but it's to say that God, if he is the author of life, if he has given us everything, and if he is the reason for human dignity, and if he has given us our dignity and is the ground of our dignity, then if killing is wrong because of our human dignity, then God is the final arbiter of that. God can take life, because he is the person who kind of gives or takes away human dignity, or who is in a position to be the arbiter of human dignity and whether killing in certain circumstances is consistent with it. But the other aspect is, if we think about other reasons why killing might be wrong, maybe because it deprives someone of a future life of value. Suppose we think that's why killing is wrong. If that's the case, then God is in a really great position to end people's lives knowing that he is not necessarily depriving them of a future life of value. Because, of course, the whole point of Christianity, or one of the whole points of Christianity, is that God does not kill people, thereby forever ending their lives and thereby forever preventing them from the possibility of having life again. The whole point is that God ends people's lives knowing that all lives have to be ended, and this world has to be entirely changed and entirely renewed, so that when God renews it and gets rid of all the bad stuff about the world and gets rid of all the evil in the world and completely renews the world, he can offer us that same life, and he can offer us that same life without killing, without tears, without evil, without sin, without any of the crap that we have to go through in this world. And he's in a position to know that he can offer us that. And so I know that God will take my life one day, or that God will allow me to die at least one day. And the reason I do not begrudge him for that at all is not because I think I have a kind of right to life even to uphold against God that can never be violated in any circumstances whatsoever. It's because I know that God has offered eternal life. And if God has offered me eternal life through Jesus, then actually it doesn't matter so much for me if he takes that from me temporarily for a time while he renews the world, because he has offered that promise that he will give it to me eternally. And if he's done that, then it's hard to see what else I can blame him for.
Okay, so wait a second. I think the abortion. I think the abortion. Well, I'll have to get back to that actually.
Sure.
So Tom, Maverick Christian Wade, you said that you would like him to respond to something. Just make that clear what you'd like him to respond to, and I'll do that. But I want to ask a question from Aiden Peterson first. He says, there's a question for Calum, unrelated to abortion, but what is your preferred response to the multiverse objection against the fine tuning argument? Yeah, completely off topic, but it's still really cool to think about. So, what is your preferred response to the multiverse?
Sure. Yeah, good question. And I think it really depends on which multiverse theory. And I think often we kind of respond generically to the multiverse objection to the fine-tuning argument without actually pinning down what kind of theory, multiverse theory we're talking about. And I think each multiverse theory has quite different responses. So one multiverse theory just says that every possible universe exists. And therefore it's inevitable that one of them would have life, and that makes complete sense. Um, the problems with this view is that obviously there's no empirical evidence for or any kind of evidence that all possible universes exist, or no independent evidence at least. It's a very weird view to have. I think almost no one I know has ever held it, other than David Lewis, a famous philosopher, and maybe some of his followers. Um, there's really little motivation for it, and of course it's immensely extravagant when you think about Occam's razor, which says do not multiply entities beyond necessity. Well, this multiplies entities pretty much as extravagantly as you possibly could. It seems to be like the ultimate kind of violation of Occam's razor, which is a fundamental principle of science where we choose the simplest hypotheses without postulating things needlessly. And so
It also
I
seems to
think,
kind of like, well, how are you going to exclude God from all possible universes?
right, of course, if all possible universes exist, then right, it's pretty likely that, or it seems very plausible that God exists.
You've got to find a way to exclude God from that. That seems unlikely.
And you have to say that God is impossible, which is a difficult thing to show, I think. Um, on the other hand, you could have a kind of empirically kind of grounded multiverse theory. And so some physicists have tried this with kind of inflationary theory and M theory and things like that. As a qualifier, I'm not a physicist, so I'm not in a great position to assess the kind of science of that. But as far as I can tell, firstly, one of the main problems is, again, that it seems fairly ontologically extravagant. It seems to be a violation of Occam's razor, at least all other things being equal. It posits many things, and possibly unnecessarily. A second problem is that often these detailed scientific multiverse theories don't actually generate enough multiverses to explain fine tuning. So fine tuning, you need trillions and trillions and trillions and many, a trillion to the power of thousands, that kind of thing, to explain the fine tuning. And these multiverse theories give you a lot of universes. They might give you, millions and trillions even, but it doesn't give you enough to explain fine tuning in many cases. Another problem is that often these theories are not very independently evidenced. So the very evidence they rely on to kind of generate this multiverse theory is the same evidence as fine tuning. And so it's not clear that there's very strong independent backing for these theories, which is why I think many physicists don't hold to them. And then finally, there's this very technical problem, which I'll do my best to explain briefly, which is a problem, I think, only with some scientific multiverse theories, but you can always ask kind of physicists who back this argument, like Luke Barnes or Rodney Holder, maybe about this. But the idea of Boltzmann brains, where essentially some of these physical theories say that a multiverse is kind of like a load of small bubble universes, and each of these has different kind of constants and conditions and so on. And if you imagine a kind of a bubble bath, the by far the most common bubbles are the really small ones, and then you might get like a few moderate sized ones, and then maybe one really big bubble if you're lucky. Um, if you think about it that way, then in the same way, those really big bubbles in this kind of multiverse are extraordinarily rare. You don't really get them very much. And what these Boltzmann brain kind of theorists seem to say, to me, at least to someone who's untrained in this, is that those theories suggest that if there were a universe if there were universes that allowed observers, that had the physical complexity and the right constants and conditions to allow observers or humans, we would expect almost all of those universes to be absolutely tiny. For example, no bigger than the size of our brain. And that's what a Boltzmann brain is. It's basically a brain that is in a universe that is barely bigger than it. And yet they say this universe is many, many times bigger than a brain. It's many, many times bigger than an observer. It's absolutely enormous. And if those theories are true, it's very unlikely that we would find ourselves in a universe this big. It's very difficult to explain why we would find ourselves in a universe which apparently is this rare on that theory. And so that for them suggests that there is something radically unexplained about this universe if those kind of inflationary theories are true, which is the problem of how our universe is so big. And that, for some of these people, it counts as a quite strong mark against those kind of scientific multiverse theories.
So what he said was, he said in response, he was hoping that you would get into Boltzmann brains. He says, since there are, here's his recent thought on the Boltzmann brain objection. Since there are so many observers in our universe, it seems to make it more probable to find yourself in a universe like this.
As far as I can tell, the Boltzmann kind of brains and the kind of bubbles will be the really common universes will just be one individual brain or one individual kind of observer or kind of, clump of matter that manages to be conscious in some mysterious way. And so it's not that so in the whole multiverse there will be lots of brains or lots of observers, but in any given universe there in almost all of these universes there will only be one observer. And so the idea that a universe would be big enough for there to be many observers within the same universe, as far as I understand the theory, is extraordinarily rare and difficult to explain. But as I say, I won't be able to say much more than that, being someone who's not trained in the relevant physics. But ask someone like Luke Barnes, maybe even someone like Nevin Kleemanhager, a philosopher at a university in Australia, who has done a lot more work on this kind of thinking. Between Luke and Nevin, probably you could get some good answers.
I think what's happening here is that Aiden has kind of an old evidence problem that he's raising, where he's saying that we have like evidence of all these other observers. And so if we include that information in our background, then we have to have a theory that's going to basically explain that. And so you can't object to it with the Boltzmann brain objection because we're already sort of assuming that we have these multiple people here. So I think what's happening is that, Aiden, what you need to do is you need to start from a more neutral starting point. So we don't want to include the information of we know that there's billions of observers in our universe. We want to start from the more neutral viewpoint of, well, what would we actually expect to see, like kind of subtracting out everything that we know, and like let's start at a more neutral starting point and say, well, what would we expect if the multiverse were true, and we'd still be able to forward the Boltzmann brain objection that way, because we'd still say that it's much more likely that the observers that are in this universe are Boltzmann brains, or at least just with like one person having this experience. And even from my own personal subjective experience, it'd be way more likely that it would just be a big illusion than that there's actually this massive universe with all these 10 to the 80th particles and everything. So hopefully that answered the objection. Anything else to say on that before we move on, Calum?
I'm fine for the moment. No, I think Luke Barnes is probably the best person to go to as far as I know on these kind of technical questions. So,
yeah, I actually already recommended him to reach out to him. So hopefully, and Aiden, just message me, like let me know if you weren't able to get in touch with Luke, and I'll be able to help make that happen. Okay, so there's one last thing that we'll do, and then we'll call it a night. So Maverick Christian, Wade Tisthammer, wants to get your take on Numbers 5, 12 through 31, which seems to... Are you familiar with that passage?
I thought you literally meant the numbers 5, 12, and 31. I was like, sure, we can go there. Let me find the passage just to remind.
Yeah, so it's actually quite a long passage.
Right, Numbers 5, was it?
Yep,
12
5,
to 31.
12 to 31. Yeah, and I can read it out loud. I don't know if I have an easy way of putting it on the screen right now because I didn't have this prepared. But it is kind of a lengthy passage to just sort of read it all out. I can, unless you want to just take a minute and read it and then respond. It sounds like that's what's going to happen.
Yeah, it's not one I'm very familiar with. So normally, the normal passage that people bring up, at least if this is supposed to be in connection with abortion, is the Exodus passage where it talks about hitting a pregnant woman and causing a miscarriage.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, let me go ahead and read
this
the whole
one,
thing
this
out.
one, I think the problem with this one is ostensibly um, the verse 21 where it says, "The Lord make you a curse and an oath among your people when the Lord makes your something fall away and your something swell." And I think from my from memory, this isn't a passage I've gone into a lot of detail on, and it's not something I've read about for a while. From memory, and maybe he wants to come back and correct me, but I think some people suggest that this is basically the God in the Old Testament kind of causing an abortion or a miscarriage, and therefore seeming to kind of undermine kind of God's value for the unborn. What I recall, and I honestly don't know the detail on this off the top of my head, but I could look it up, is that the kind of terms, especially for womb and kind of baby, or depending on your translation, those kind of terms are actually very, very controversial. And so my translation in the ESV says, "Makes your thigh fall away and your body swell." And on that superficial reading, at least, it's nothing to do with abortion in any obvious sense. Um, Even though in some translations it might seem to be implying some sort of miscarriage. I think from memory that's what this passage often gets at, but I'm happy to go back and
Yep.
hear something
Yeah,
else.
that's what it's about. Yeah. If you have gone astray while married to your husband and you have made yourself impure by having sexual relations with a man other than your husband, here the priest is to put the woman under this curse. Quote, "May the Lord cause you to become a curse among your people when he makes your womb miscarry and your abdomen swell. May this water
Right.
that brings a curse enter your body so that your abdomen swells or your womb miscarries."
Yeah. So from memory, and I'd have to look up the reference to where I read about this. It might be in David Albert Jones's book, The Soul of the Embryo, because he has a very good kind of historical coverage of Christian tradition on abortion and their interpretation of some of these Old Testament passages. It might be that book, but I'll have to go back and look. But I think the response that I've heard is that essentially these terms are very difficult to translate, and that's, I mean, we know that's the case from things like Genesis. Body parts in general in the Old Testament are quite difficult to translate properly, so the rib in Genesis is very likely not a rib, according to most contemporary scholars, I think. And no one actually really has any idea what that word actually refers to. Likewise here, I think it's actually very difficult to know what is going on, and I think it's far from obvious that it's a miscarriage that's being described.
Interesting. Yeah, because it also mentions sexual relations, having sexual relations in verse 20. If you've gone astray while married to your husband and you have made yourself impure by having sexual relations with a man other than your husband, maybe that's what's sort of informing this latter part. This talking about a miscarriage.
Yeah, it's possible. It's really, yeah, it's difficult to say. I think it's probably one that even the scholars might not have much idea what it's referring to. But as I say, I can look up where I read about this and give a more detailed account.
Okay, you maybe like in a blog post or maybe on Facebook or something that I can link
Sure.
to. Okay. All right, sounds good. Well, we're gonna go ahead and call it a night, guys. Thanks for your questions. Thanks for joining us for the after show. It's been really fun. And if you guys want to get in contact with Calum, how can they contact you? What's the best way? Just through your blog?
Yeah, so blog or email, which is quite easily findable on the blog or Facebook. I should say it takes me ages to respond to them. That's not because I'm not going to respond. And I know one of your listeners tonight has an email awaiting a response. I do really try and get around to all of them eventually. It just takes a while sometimes. So I have a backlog, but um, as long as it's not like abusive or spam, then I try to respond to everything, even though it can take some time. So Facebook or email or yeah is usually
Cool.
best.
I wish I would have done this in the public live stream. But what resources do you recommend for people that want to look deeper into abortion and the topic? Like who's the best pro life advocate author or ethicist?
Yeah, great question. I think it really depends on the particular area. So in terms of the actual philosophy and the kind of people who are most interested in metaphysics and ethics and stuff. The best stuff, in my opinion, is someone who hasn't actually written their book yet, or they haven't finished their book, is David Hirshenov, who I mentioned earlier. But he's got all his papers on his website, and he responds really well, I think, and really cogently and very in a very informed way on a lot of the kind of abstract philosophical and ethical issues. The best book probably is Christopher Kazor, Kaczor, his book The Ethics of Abortion in its second edition. But otherwise, there's kind of there are a lot of issues, I think, particularly in this debate, where it's not even necessarily about the kind of ethical debate. There's a lot of policy questions and policy issues, and often theological issues. Theologically, the best book I think is The Soul of the Embryo by David Albert Jones, at least on the history of theology. John Wyatt's book, Matters of Life and Death, is great on Christian bioethics in general. Um, Otherwise, for responding to a lot of the policy stuff, and Scott Klusendorf's book is a great intro and a good book on kind of the Christian position on life. On a lot of the policy stuff and some of the kind of more technical, ethical questions, it's often not necessarily books that are best, but particular papers. And probably the best way to find those is on my website. If you click the bioethics tab and then you click abortion handout, I have a handout which needs updating, but it has a lot of references to kind of every kind of major thing that comes up. And at the bottom, it has a whole list of references for like particular questions and particular kind of problematic issues or studies, that kind of thing. So have a look there, and there should be something there too.
Cool. All right, man. Well, thanks for joining me again, and we'll do something else in the future, I'm sure. So,
Absolutely.
yeah,
Thank you so much for having me again, and thanks to all your listeners for their patience.
awesome. You guys have a good night, and Christianity is true. So, see you guys later.